Indeed, I mean, both very, I think, level-headed and accessible presentations, and I say that with admiration, I think have left us all with a number of points at which we could extend their contributions. So I don't have one particular line to suggest here and would leave it open to the rest of you. Allison has a thought.
Maybe I'll open with this question. Do you think, the two presenters, do you think that Ian Byrne's career path that you described, leaving the art market that he criticizes in the article, and then coming back around to academe in a way, back into that, would you describe that career path, that pattern, as something that Bourdieu might explain as exactly what Bourdieu explains, which is this example of the outside position then becoming the inside position, or not?
I'll just say briefly that there are a lot of people who come to that realization in the 60s and 70s that if art for them is not going to be politics, or loses for them its privileged position with respect to politics, and they drop out. There's a huge number of artists who do that in the US and in Europe, from Charlotte Poznanski to Lee Lozano, and on and on and on. But since it's Paul's own trajectory, maybe a little bit, maybe he wants to...
I think I mean, it's true enough what you've said. But the only thing I'd add in, I think, is that it's not Ian Byrne's fault, as it were, or indeed any of those individuals. There's a sense of history having developed. The sense which I take it that lies behind Ian Byrne's move out of the art world into the one that I described was, and one which was shared by several other people, both in the United States and in our own case in Britain, was to engage in the possibilities that seemed to be around in the 70s for developing a more broadly based radical culture beyond the art world altogether. And that the circumstances that were mentioned earlier on, politically the coming to power of the Reagan and Thatcher governments, and economically this turn from the post-war settlement that we had a kind of Keynesian social democratic economy in Europe at least, to a full-blown market-dominated system. It's that eroded the place, if you like, that Ian and other people like him, to a certain extent myself, went to. And that's what that sort of half joke about being caught and brought back was alluding to. It was something beyond not just his control, but the control of a whole range of people who made sort of radical noises and radical interventions at this particular time. And I think that's the consequence that, in a sense, we're still living with. The bureaucratization of everything.
Yeah, being caught and brought back, of course, evokes slavery. And the realms of academia, and they're maybe not gilded cages, but chromium cages in which we are able to, spend time having the sort of discussions we're having now, looking at what were those seem to be urgent life choices in retrospect, without them pressing upon us at the moment, which may be a very temporary hiatus, when the new dispensation decides actually how it's going to dispose of the sphere that we occupy.
Did you say wasn't pressing on us, Tom?
That is the potential choice to, as Ian Byrne ascribes the role of the artist as always already in the market, as the work at its moment of conception is already a part of a market circuit. And I thought you were saying that recognition led him to flee the art world for something that actually gave substance to the radicalism that he was beginning to feel was a hollow claim for any form of art making.
If you change the word flee, I'd probably agree to a certain extent. Flee seems to connote something which is kind of beaten down somehow, and I think it was more seen as a kind of going on, if you like. And it's the defeat of the possibility of that, which I think is something that we live with. And to that extent, I think that the set of problems which he talked about, transposed to our own day, do bear down on us very, very powerfully now. And certainly it's the case in, my own walk of life, in sort of institutions of higher education in England, that the domination of the market is penetrating right into the very fabric of scholarship in a way that it was inconceivable even 5 years ago, 10 years ago at the most. And so if I don't think it behoves us to feel that these issues somehow don't press down on us, because, in my own daily experience, boy, they do. And how you respond to that, whether there's this sort of slightly performative sense of presenting a moving target, or whether there's a slightly more idealistic sense of having to do something, to have an effect. Those questions, I think, are very, very significant for everyone in this particular boat that we're in.
Okay. Who else? Jonathan.
Well, absolutely. And one of the things that's so very striking is that to raise a voice like Ian Burns's voice today would be embarrassing. One wouldn't see it. And yet, I've recognized, for example, with Hide Seek, how profoundly, the exhibition I did, how profoundly market considerations governed, for example, whether or not one could borrow a painting, and in an exhibition in which you discuss the sexuality of the artist, that was, depending on which institution in question, something that was simply, not a possibility or grudgingly accepted. And so market became a big part of this. But I guess the question that I want to ask, and it's an obvious point, is that we ended the last time, just before our break, with this idea that we were perhaps on the cusp of something where we could think through a form of resistance to the all-imbricating possibilities, right? And so many of our texts, in one way or another, elaborate how profoundly we're caught. And I want to ask, given this situation, is there a way to and it's terribly unfair to ask this of the two of you, but I will. Is there a way that we can think through a discussion about capital that doesn't, first thing, engender embarrassment, and that does actually offer forms of possibility for re-articulation, re-engagement, redescription of the problem?
Why are you embarrassed to talk about capitalism?
Well,
no, it's also an older form of discourse. Mike. It was a small one. It's okay. Jonathan, is your point that to talk about capital at this point is like so yesterday that we're on to smaller and better fish now, right, as it were, right? So, I mean, that might be, yeah. If I could associate the question you asked with one that Hal asked earlier that I, really enjoyed, the question of deliverables in the academy, right, or in the university. Now you have, in order to be a liberal studies person, you have to have certain deliverables. And I was wondering if Hal could elaborate on that, and if we can maybe engage that in association with the question that Jonathan asked, because I think it's really important. And I also want to ask, how does that shape the nature of the discourse we are, quote unquote, permitted to make?
I really don't have much to say. I mean, it's just to the point that Paul made, that in this country too, we are asked to render instrumental what we teach, write, and so on, how we are producers. And, you know, there's a conference every week somewhere in this country about this problem. And usually it's framed in terms of how to make the humanities relevant again. And art history had, saw a possibility, I think, in visual studies to argue that if we're a society of the image, which is not so clear to me anymore, people need to be visually literate. There's an idea of visual literacy. And there are, attempts to retool art history a couple of times over the last few decades in terms of whatever particular twist there might be. I mean, in Capital Formations, Matthew mentioned this text by the French sociologists Boltanski and Chiapello, The New Spirit of Capitalism, which argues that, in a way, capital in this moment needs artistic types. I mean, you asked for rejections or rebuttals. I'm happy to give you one of that thesis at some future date, not this second. But it seems to me that there's this extraordinary anxiety now, and it's gone on for a while, about what we should do, as if we're embarrassed that we might be completely outmoded. And my feeling more and more is that we should just do what we have done, do it more intensely, that books should not, for example, be formatted somehow for the Kindle, but they should be, written more intensely, edited more intensely, produced more intensely, made more the way that they are. And that rather than reach out for relevance, not to celebrate our outmoded status, but we might actually find a purchase in a different kind of temporality. I'm not convinced by the temporality that Matthew has proposed, that we can't do anything about the present, so we just launch time capsules to the future. But I think that there are kinds of experiences that we can insist upon that are not instrumental and might still be critical, but might actually have a particular relevance in their sheer irrelevance. But now I've really begun to babble.
Yeah, and I feel troubled to some extent by, that kind of wall that goes up whenever you start talking about theory sometimes in certain circles. Not here, obviously. But I mean, in terms of
what circles?
In terms of deliverables and like what's okay to talk about in art history, it's like that seems to me to be the greatest instantiation of the binary between history and theory, or the social and theory, right? Because I see the two as inextricable. I use theory to understand history. But is theory something that would be considered deliverable, or is it so, quote, pie in the sky or something like that, that, it's too abstract that we can't use this or something like that? That's troubling, because I think that we need theory as a tool, right? Or some kind of apparatus by which to break down those barriers and understand how to modify our imbrication, if we can.
Well, it might be more deliverable. That is to say that it can be rendered. Bourdieu has a nice passage where he talks about the goal of certain cultural producers to generate a charismatic name for what they're doing. It comes towards the end of the essay. And finding and patenting a label or a name has become one kind of career goal that leads to great circulation and longevity for your work, because as the term becomes circulated in a way, your originating of it gets inevitably mentioned, and so there's a greater density of your presence in the larger network of published discourse around a subject. And they can be made very teachable, because basically you just need to learn a sort of list of names and a sort of quick guide to their application, and a delimited set of works of art that exemplify the operation of these particular signifiers. I'm making it sound pretty invidious, but it does actually convey quite a lot of important original theoretical insight in a way that can be then widely disseminated and used in a pedagogical context. Whereas, the intricacies of a kind of micro-history that another subject might entail, which seem incommensurable to other micro-histories, are very difficult to circulate, unless they can be made to seem exemplary in some way, like a little movie. A group of historians back in the 80s who had a lot to do with, I think, the art world. Carlo Ginzburg and Natalie Davis were kind of masters of finding these little micro-histories that contained cultural and symbolic anomalies that lots of people could quickly get. But that's not generally the case for intricate, archivally based, new discovery, new information-driven kinds of art history, which has hardly been broached in today's discussion. But I just want to put down a marker and say that this still really matters. And, it is going to be important, as Hal says, to intensify the things that are good that we already do, irrespective of the affirmation or not that it receives.
Can I just sort of agree and disagree with these last two things? Because I mean, mostly agree, but before it sort of melts away from my head, that Hal's point about intensifying what we already do. I mean, in a sense, I think part of what sort of puzzles me and exercises me, and it's how we draw the line between two different kinds of intensification, I suppose. One is the sense of, intensification can mean, like Tom's point here, about sort of burrowing into the archive or something like that and just getting lost within your specialism, as a kind of retreat, I suppose, from some of the the tornadoes that are blowing in the world outside. At the same time, there is something which seems, just pious about seeking to have an effect as an art historian or how it just seems, sort of. I mean, if anything's outmoded, surely it's that, this slightly Victorian sort of preachy sense of, well, one doesn't want that either. It's how you judge where the intensification can have some kind of, sort of opening up qualities to it rather than just confirming everything as it is. That's the kind of art, in a sense, isn't it? That's the thing that's so difficult to do. And, I mean, in terms of, I'm thinking of Jim's work to a certain extent. There's one of the few people who sort of tries to look at the implications of two quite closely related but also quite separate, what would you call them, problems? The idea of a sort of globalized art history, of looking beyond our own tradition in historical terms, but also seeing how that sort of impacts and interacts with the very situation that we're in the contemporary, with globalization. Those kinds of, that sort of interstices between those areas seem to me, that's about intensifying what it is to do art history now. But how the hell you do it without making a fool of yourself? But that's as far as I get, and I'm sort of working without a net at that point.
It's interesting to be talking about making fools out of ourselves and embarrassing ourselves and things like that. I just had two things to add about. One, about intensity. There was an event which I helped organize in Chicago a couple years ago that Michael and Keith ran about visual studies. And there was no consensus, but one of the interesting things was the idea of a sort of a non-activist visual studies, which is not at all, the way it once was, kept coming up, and intensity was one of the metaphors that we were thinking of. The other thing I just wanted to add about deliverables, a field that I follow that is PhDs for studio artists, which is thriving around the world and coming to our shores soon, is very instrumentalized. There's an enormous literature in Europe. I think that that last year was the final year in which anyone could read all the books and literature that's been produced. 4 huge books came out last year. And it's deeply instrumentalized, not necessarily always politically, but in terms of outcomes.
This is actually an issue that I have a lot of opinions about. The whole, if we want to use the word deliverables or whatever it is, the REA, which apparently has a different name now, the REF, the research, that's hard to even say, Research Excellence Framework in the UK, which is a bizarre, it's almost incomprehensible that it actually exists, attempt to quantify scholarly activity. And this is taking place at precisely the moment when any vital scholarly activity is going to be moving in directions that we can't even imagine trying to quantify. And that's such that I'm interested in something. I'm interested in forms of intensification that I envision moving in 2 different directions. One, towards defending the archival, the specificity of minor questions in minor places, all of that. But how do we maintain a funding structure for that? My logic is, at the same time that we pursue that on one side, we need to perform modes of chaos and strangeness that will recruit clients. So we do client recruitment through any form of bizarre activity that will succeed. And we don't need this at the good schools, but the American middle class will not know anything about Latin poetry unless we figure out some way of creating sufficient chaos that the legislators in Georgia will say, well, the clients want it, so we've got to pay for it. Because if we continue to rely on the largesse of the Georgia legislature, I think it's safe to say that's going to just evaporate. So we have to be aggressive in our forms of intensity, and we don't have a model for what forms of intensity will work in this client recruitment drive. But I do not see I don't see another option other than creating deliverables that we don't know how to describe yet. They're different deliverables. Because the retreat model, which I'm not saying that that's what you were advocating, Tom, but I've said enough.
Yeah, it's not, I would just say briefly, actually going out and finding something in an unusual place that nobody knew before is not necessarily a retreat. It could be, an odyssey, a quest, an exploration. But it's risky because you may come back with very little or something of relatively minor significance, or you might find something that changes, some fundamental assumption that people hold. Though the danger is these days, I have to say, that even if you did come back with that, and even if you published it, there's no guarantee that it's going to be assimilated or that will actually change the trajectory of what it might, in empirical terms, affect. Because there is a lot of inertia, having to do with prior investment in whatever current paradigm is still dominant.
Well, my question to you would be how you feel about one of the things that I think is an upbeat development is that logically within the next 15 years we will develop these people who have developed forms of knowledge through the availability of information that we couldn't imagine today. People will be sort of self-taught PhDs in obscure subjects. And it hasn't really worked out that. So the popularization of pedagogy, just the obvious examples of Wikipedia or things like this, the amount of information one can pursue is so much greater. So the assault that's taking place now is distance learning, which, yeah, do you have a distance learning issue? Please, explain.
Just the big example is the Stanford University course with 160,000 students and 20,000 graduates last year.
And is distance, my assumption is to defeat distance learning, one would have to create, again, situations in a classroom that are akin to a band playing in a club. The recording industry did not destroy live music because something happened at the club that couldn't be replicated. Something needs to happen in the classrooms that cannot be replicated by the distance learning technology. And we don't yet know how to do that, I don't think.
One of the things that's happened to us, that one of our, well, almost our only forum for having a classroom interaction, rather than the distance learning thing that you're talking about, it is under threat, shall we say. It's going to be taken away because it's too volatile, it's too dangerous, it's too expensive. And Bryony herself will know that how productive those situations were once upon a time.
I don't know, maybe this is taking this away from, I mean, I feel like the woman who's not waving but drowning, or drowning and not waving. But I don't want to bring it back to a sort of stupid, foolish kind of optimism because I'm the first to agree about the pernicious state of what's happening in education. We're deeply involved in it too. How to make ourselves kind of suicidal at the end of the day is to think about what's happening to education and to think about the market, yeah? I mean, shall we just all drown now? Because in a way and I'm not underestimating that, you know, I think we understand that, and I think, you know, it's nothing that would be unfamiliar to any of us, that, you know, these great analyses of how the market works seem to teach the market brilliant lessons that they turn to their own advantage, which of course is the survival of the institution and so on. We know all that. But one thing I feel that we're missing, or maybe this is my deeply rooted optimism, or some sense of wanting to hold on to something about the practice of art. Because in one sense, Paul, what you actually drew our attention to, as you did, Tom, at the very beginning when you looked at the Jeff Wall text, this was Ian Burnett's An Artist text. This is a moment where, you know, this was part of an artist's practice, and these seismic shifts within our discipline happened at these moments, I think, of real proximity with the practice of art. And what I feel is a fairly important question is not so much how, as the academy, you know, we can self-generate, because I don't actually see much hope in that. It seems to me that we are hopefully not parasitic upon art and the work that artists do, but actually it has to in some way be a kind of symbiotic process, and that we should maybe listen to artists, and we can't reduce all the art that gets produced to the pernicious effects of the market. We may all understand how markets work. You know, a lot of the literature around globalization has been very useful in helping us understand the economics of the art market. I don't think it explains away how art functions in that newly globalized world. And I think, you know, it is necessary for us to think about how art continues to get made and how the practice of criticism can continue to get made, because it does. You know, and there's some set of questions about survival, or I would even call kind of resilience, without wanting some kind of, you know, adaptation to social and economic norms. And I just feel that's kind of deeply important, and we can't lose sight of it. That's
presumably why some of us do what we do, because there is something about art that actually is resistant in some ways and can't be reducible.